The forest had always been thick with secrets. Towering trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted by years of weathering storms, created a labyrinth of shadows. Beneath their canopy, the earth was soft with moss, and every step taken was muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. The occasional howl of wind through the trees was the only sound that broke the deep silence, apart from the calls of birds hidden far above and the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. At the heart of this vast, isolated expanse was a small wildlife sanctuary. Its presence was subtle, woven into the environment, its boundaries almost indistinguishable from the untamed wilderness surrounding it. Here, animals roamed freely, birds in the treetops, deer in the clearing, and even the occasional wolf, though their presence was rare. The sanctuary, though remote, had its keepers. Two men who had devoted their lives to protecting these creatures and studying them in their natural habitat. It was on one cold, mist-shrouded morning that the strange events began. The cat, a sleek, jet-black creature with golden eyes that gleamed like lanterns in the dark, was not an ordinary resident of the sanctuary. She had arrived years ago, wandering through the gates as though she had always belonged. No one knew her true origins. Some of the animals here had been rescued from poachers, others brought in after being injured in the wild. But the cat, with her elegant step and sharp gaze, seemed to have come of her own volition. She had claimed the woods as her kingdom and always remained distant, even from the humans who ran the sanctuary. The men, Mark and Ellis, had grown accustomed to the cat's silent presence. She would appear on the edge of their sight, watching them with eyes that always seemed to know more than they should. There was something eerie about her, something unsettling. But she was part of the land, as much a part of the woods as the wind or the river, and they never questioned her. However, that morning was different. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. Mark was the first to notice it as he walked through the dense woods, his boots squelching in the damp earth. Ellis, meanwhile, was at the small cabin they had built, working with some maps and reports from a recent expedition. He had heard nothing but the quiet rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of birds, and the distant crackle of a twig breaking underfoot. But Mark had felt something. The forest was too still. No animals moved, not even the birds. He paused, listening. There was something amiss. It was then that he saw her, standing in the clearing, just beyond the thick fog that hovered at knee-heel, the cat. Her golden eyes were fixed on him, unwavering. Her tail flicked once, sharply, but she didn't move otherwise. Mark took a step forward, instinctively reaching for his rifle, though he knew there was no danger here, not from the cat, not from anything. But a sense of unease prickled the back of his neck, an unease that grew as he approached. The further he walked, the heavier the air seemed. The trees appeared unnaturally still, and the forest felt wrong. Mark's gaze never left the cat, who was now moving slower, deliberate, each paw placed with careful precision. He had always felt the cat was a harbinger, a silent sentinel of this place, but this time it felt different. This time there was an almost palpable urgency in her steps, as though she was trying to communicate something. Something important. When he reached the clearing, the fog rolled thickly at his feet, and the cat was gone. Mark's heart raced as he scanned the area, every instinct on alert. The silence was deafening. Not a single animal sound, not even the whisper of the wind. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. A faint rustling to his left made him turn sharply. His pulse quickened as a shadow moved among the trees. Something large, something with purpose. His rifle, still in his hand, seemed useless now. The shadow emerged fully into the clearing. It was a bear, massive and hulking, its eyes gleaming with something unnatural. Mark instinctively took a step back, heart thundering in his chest. The bear did not advance, but its eyes remained fixed on Mark with an unsettling intensity. For a moment everything hung in a delicate balance, the stillness suffocating. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and lumbered back into the fog, its massive shape swallowed by the trees. Mark stood there, breathing heavily, confusion clouding his thoughts. What had just happened? Why had it left? And why was the forest so eerily silent? As he made his way back to the cabin, the fog thickened and the air seemed to grow colder. His thoughts were clouded with doubt. Something was wrong. Something was shifting in the woods. When he returned to the cabin, Ellis was at the window, staring out into the mist. He didn't need to ask. The tension was visible on his face, just as it had been on Mark's. He had felt it too. The night fell, and with it a restless energy seemed to take hold of the sanctuary. The wind began to howl through the trees, and strange noises, scratching sounds from the depths of the woods, carried on the air. The distant calls of owls and the screech of bats seemed out of place, frantic in their urgency. The cat was nowhere to be seen, but Mark could feel her presence in the very bones of the forest. It wasn't until the following morning that the twist, the true mystery, revealed itself. Ellis was the first to discover it. He had gone to check on the wildlife pens, but what he found was beyond his comprehension. The animals, usually skittish but contained in their enclosures, were gone. Their pens were torn apart, cages shattered. Even the wild boar, the most ferocious creature in the sanctuary, had fled. But it was the signs left behind that struck terror into Ellis's heart. Claw marks, deep and vicious, scarred the earth, marks far larger than any animal could make. And in the middle of the destruction lay something else. A single tuft of black fur. Ooms from the cat? The forest had become a different place. The tension, once subtle, was now undeniable. The air was thick with unease, as though something was hunting within its depths. Something older and far more dangerous than anything Mark and Ellis had ever imagined. Hours later they saw her. The cat, once regal and distant, now stood on a high ridge overlooking the forest, her golden eyes gleaming like twin suns, her fur bristling with an energy that wasn't entirely her own. The winds howled once more, and the forest seemed to exhale a collective breath. The cat had known too much, and whatever it was coming. The mystery of the sanctuary was about to unravel, and the cat, the only one who had always been a part of this untamed world, was the key to understanding it. But there was no going back. The creatures of the forest had awakened, and the land had its own plans for those who dared to intrude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the last whispers of the forest faded, and the truth, hidden deep within the heart of the wild, was about to be uncovered. But no one, not even the cat, could predict how it would end. The night descended quickly, swallowing the sanctuary in darkness. The wind had picked up again, rustling the trees and sending shadows darting across the ground like fleeting phantoms. Mark and Ellis, unnerved, sat together in the cabin, the only warmth coming from the crackling fire. But even the fire couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in their bones, nor could it push back the unease that gripped their hearts. Ellis couldn't stop glancing nervously out the window, where the forest loomed like a wall of blackness. It was as if the trees themselves were waiting, listening. Mark, on the other hand, was fixated on the cat. It had never been more than a strange presence, silent, distant, but tonight she felt more like an omen. The wind outside howled louder, and Mark could swear he heard the faint sound of something larger moving in the trees, something too heavy to be any animal they were familiar with. His heart raced as his mind tried to piece together the strange series of events. First, the unnatural silence of the forest, then the strange appearance of the bear, now the disappearance of the animals, and the cat's unmistakable warning. Suddenly, Ellis stood up, his face pale as a ghost. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Mark froze, listening. At first, he heard nothing but the distant wail of the storm and the crackle of the fire, but then a low, guttural sound broke the stillness. It was not a normal animal call. It wasn't a howl or a growl. It was a sound of something ancient, something that didn't belong. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The sound was coming from deep in the woods, too deep for any creature they had ever encountered in the sanctuary. It wasn't just a call, it was a command, like the very earth itself was speaking. Without a word, both men moved toward the door. Mark's hand trembled as he reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, his fingers slick with sweat. His instincts screamed at him to stay inside, to hide, to wait for whatever was coming to pass, but there was no time. The noise had stopped, but the air was still charged, crackling with the energy of something unseen. The cat's warning was still in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. They stepped outside, their boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The air was thick, and the fog was heavier than ever. Every step felt like a trek into another world. The forest was eerily silent again, too silent. And then, through the mist, they saw her. The cat. She was standing near the edge of the forest, her eyes glowing like twin beacons, reflecting the light of the half-hidden moon. She was watching them, but there was something different about her now. The cat seemed taller, somehow, more imposing. Her fur appeared to shimmer with an iridescence, and as Mark's gaze lingered, he saw the faint outline of shadows moving beneath her fur. Something darker, something alive. For the first time, Mark felt an icy grip of fear tighten around his chest. The cat wasn't just a creature of the woods anymore. She was something far older, far more dangerous. Without thinking, Ellis took a step forward, his voice breaking the silence. What happened to the animals? Where did they go? But as he spoke, the ground beneath their feet trembled. Just slightly, but enough for them to notice. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Something was coming. Something far worse than they could have imagined. The cat's gaze didn't leave them, her golden eyes never blinking. A distant rumble echoed through the forest, like the deep growl of something enormous. The trees around them began to sway violently, though the wind hadn't picked up. There was no storm, but the earth itself seemed to be reacting to the presence of something ancient. Mark turned, looking into the dark forest, his mind racing. That's when he saw it. From the darkness beyond the trees, shadows began to emerge. At first, they seemed like nothing more than figures in the fog, but as they drew closer, their shapes became clearer. Massive shapes, shifting and moving in the mist. Tall humanoid forms that glided effortlessly through the trees. The air grew colder with every step they took, and a deep, unsettling feeling settled in Mark's stomach. The cat had known. She had known for a long time. These weren't just animals. These were creatures of legend, born from the forest's deepest secrets, awakened by something powerful, something that the cat had been guarding against. The shadows advanced, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Mark's breath hitched in his throat. And then, in the sudden silence that followed, the cat made her move. With a swift leap, she dashed into the clearing, her body moving like a blur. Her eyes were focused, intense. The shadows paused for a moment, and Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The cat stopped in front of them, her back arched, her fur standing on end as though she were facing an invisible enemy. The creatures, once looming with dark energy, hesitated, as though they were uncertain of something. Mark could feel the tension between them. Something old, something primordial, at the very heart of the woods. And then, the ground shook once more. This time, it wasn't just a tremor. The earth cracked. deep fissures splitting the ground as the ancient, hidden power of the forest rose to the surface. The shadows recoiled as though they had been burned by the very ground beneath them. The cat, her golden eyes alight with a terrible brilliance, stood her ground unshaken. It was as if she had summoned the earth itself to protect the sanctuary. In the final moments, just before the night broke into chaos, Mark saw the truth. The cat was no ordinary creature. She was the guardian of the forest, an entity bound to the land itself, tasked with keeping something far more dangerous at bay. The creatures, the shadows, the beasts of legend, they were not of this world. They had come for the sanctuary, and they had come for her. But the cat knew how to fight, and as the forest rumbled, Mark realized something he would never forget. The cat had always known too much. She wasn't just guarding the sanctuary. She was protecting them all. And in the end, it was she who decided the fate of the wild. The forest grew silent again, but the tension still hung in the air, as though the world was waiting for what would come next. But the cat stood tall, her eyes still glowing in the mist, guarding the land and the secrets it held. And for Mark and Ellis, there would be no returning to the life they had known. The forest had changed, and they had seen a glimpse of something ancient and powerful that would forever alter their understanding of the natural world. The silence that followed the confrontation was suffocating. The trees stood still, their branches barely swaying in the faint breeze as if they too were holding their breath. The cat, her eyes now a dim glowing embers, seemed to blend into the night, her presence both ethereal and commanding. The creatures from the shadows had retreated, vanishing into the depths of the forest as suddenly as they had appeared. Mark and Ellis stood frozen, their bodies heavy with the weight of what they had just witnessed. The ground beneath their feet still hummed with a residual tremor, the faintest vibrations echoing through their bones, as though the very earth itself had been disturbed. They couldn't look away from the cat, who was now motionless, almost statuesque, her gaze fixed on the darkness that had claimed the forest. The night felt different now. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the chirping of crickets, had all fallen silent. A heavy stillness had settled over everything, as if the world were waiting for something, waiting for them to make a move. Ellis was the first to break the silence, his voice low and shaky. "Do you think it's over?" Mark swallowed, his throat dry. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like that before. The cat, she wasn't just a cat. He couldn't finish the sentence. It seemed impossible to explain what had just happened, impossible to grasp the reality of it. But in his heart he knew. The cat had always been more than just a part of the sanctuary. She had always been watching, guarding, waiting. Slowly, Mark took a step toward her, the cold night air pressing against his skin like 1,000 unseen hands. The fire in the cabin seemed miles away, its warmth a distant memory. His mind raced, but his body moved instinctively, drawn toward the cat, as if the forest itself was urging him to approach. Ellis followed, though his steps were hesitant. He glanced nervously over his shoulder as though expecting the shadows to return. The last tremor of the earth still rattled his nerves, and the eerie silence only deepened his unease. When they reached the cat, she didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the dark expanse of trees that lay beyond the clearing. It was as if she were watching for something. Waiting. Mark crouched down beside her, his breath visible in the chill of the night. His heart pounded in his chest, and the fear that had gripped him earlier returned in full force. But he couldn't turn back. He couldn't leave her alone, not after what they had just seen. He reached out, slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might vanish if he touched her. The moment his fingers brushed against her fur, he felt a strange warmth surge through him, an energy that seemed to pulse from the very core of the earth itself. The cat didn't flinch. Instead, her fur seemed to shimmer for a moment, as though she were becoming one with the forest. In that instant, something shifted in the air. A subtle change, but one that was impossible to ignore. The ground beneath them seemed to hum louder, and the trees around them creaked, their trunks bending ever so slightly as though they were moving in rhythm with an ancient song. It wasn't the wind, it was something else, something alive, something in the very roots of the forest. Mark glanced up at Ellis, whose eyes were wide with fear, but before either of them could speak, the earth trembled again. This time it was stronger, more violent. The trees groaned, their branches twisting and shaking as though they were fighting against some unseen force. The ground cracked open at their feet, revealing a deep, yawning chasm that stretched into the darkness below. The cat was standing now, her posture regal, her tail flicking slightly in a way that seemed almost deliberate. Mark felt the ground shift under him, as though the very earth was alive and responding to her. He could feel the power, the depth of the force that lay beneath them, as though they were standing on the edge of something vast and ancient. Ellis stepped back, his face pale. "Mark, we need to get out of here. Something's wrong. This isn't right." But Mark couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on the chasm that was opening before them. There was something in the air, something older than the forest itself. It was calling them. It was calling him.